Yeah, thank you very much. So a part of my talk is about handling failure. We had a pretty good example so far. Everybody remain calm. Thank you. Hopefully my talk will cross paths with some of I watched today. So I have no funky dog. I didn't make my honeymoon in Florence. Yet I don't use refinements and I use service objects a lot. Okay, so everybody seems to be very cautious as well. So we began with Xavier. So I'm very cautious too. I won't provide any truths, yet I'd like to make like some state of the art of what we find in the Ruby community. Maybe you'll find some of the techniques you use. Of course, I have my own opinion, but well, we'll see along the flow. Yeah, so hopefully some directions. I hope I won't, because I'm gonna show many different techniques, but most of them are quite different. So yeah, just pick the one you like best. So first, structure and change your Poros. There's a lot of words inside, and Poro is a bit, it's a very strange name, and I suspect. It was to avoid the Goro, because good old is usually used, but Goro sounds really gross if you know Mortal Kombat. And yeah, just keep because, well. Anyway, so naming programming is very complicated, so that's why we say Poro, even if that's no meaning. But the very use case is to encapsulate logic. Simone just gave a great example just before. And so the popular use is service object. Actually, AKA application service, operation, common strategy pattern, method object. So yeah, even there, naming is complicated. In the scope of this talk, I'm going to use service object. I hope you will follow me with this one. So, sort of definition. It's supposed to show what your app does. So, it's supposed to express your business logic. It's framework independent. It's supposed to be specialized, and because of its name, it also bears a context. Like you could have a service object which is a create user. So you know the context, you know whenever you create a user, you have to maybe send an email or something. So there are no conditional validations, there are no conditional callbacks. It's a wall in itself, and it's very convenient. So it has been debated for years, so it's really not new at all. There are tons of gems. Maybe you use some of them, and they apply different strategies. I couldn't resist to create mine, which is at the bottom, but I guess there are many others. There are even books, so there is Trailblazer, which is quite a trend those days. Nick told me you don't need a coupon because the Trailblazer book 1 is free. Yet I have a coupon for the fearless refactoring, if you wish, so just tell me, I'll tell you. So, about service objects, so there are topics pretty much settled, and there are some others which are much disputed. So let's first start on a sane ground and talk about what is it's okay-ish for most people. First, naming, which is very good surprise because indeed naming is always so complicated, but yet. Few public methods and the way to test them. So naming, mostly we use for service objects, naming as like verbs because they are supposed to do something and not to represent something. So your service object can handle data, which represents stuff, but they mostly do, and they are named out of verbs. Then few public methods. So if you can, there is only one to trigger the object. So we will see how different techniques I've seen here and there. And then it really depends on how, which flavor of service objects you chose. But I have much code to debate those, so I'm going to go quick here. And test, so your service objects are supposed to be reusable. So basically, if you have service objects to create, to build, you could definitely use them right out of the box in your specs. So there is no reason in your spec to create objects differently from the rest of the applications, the real passes. So, and you could even push it to the way that, because in the end, what everybody does on your website or application is the result of actions, of different actions, and different actions are your service objects. You could even have a setup where you just call your service object one by one, and you end up within the good and the real environment, which is the most important, and not Fantasyland of mock and stubs. So it has a cost because it could be many actions in database, but well, it's something to consider. So mostly disputed. There are many. How to trigger the action? Do we or do we not have to coerce arguments? The file structure, the response, and the failure handling. So triggering. Let's zoom a bit. So you have class-based. So basically, the most popular and usual suspects are call, run, or perform. So it's one of the way people do it, and the other one is basically instance-based. And even in instance-based, you have different flavors. So people pass arguments to the new, or they pass the arguments to the performing method. So, well, it's very up to you. It's basically your choice. Then for args coercion, actually, I know it has been a trend. I don't use it, but I know people like it for many, I suppose, good reasons. I just don't. So there are Virtus and many different gems which do the trick, and it's part of the most popular stuff inside service objects. So file structure, so here it's interesting. So basically in Rails, you have many different ways, and because of the way constants are loaded, you can have like very weird cases. So the first one is you basically create a services folder, and then you have the redundant service name inside for each class. So I don't like it actually. So you have the create account service, okay. Then the second option would be to have just create account, which is okay. We have the Trailblazer way to do it, but there is a load trick involved because otherwise Rails would complain and would not look for this pass. And there is another one, in order to please Rails, make an empty folder inside a folder, which is completely absurd, but this way you have a namespace. And yeah, I like namespaces, so that's the way I do. So response, there are plenty of options. You could have a service which responds to like a success question mark method and say Boolean, basically. There are service objects which renders a response object by itself, completely independent. It could be the service itself, which bears a few public methods, additional public methods in order to expose what they did maybe and the success or failure. And there is the no response, which is basically event-based, and we're going to see a few examples. So ending failure. So we talked about Go before. It's obsessed by the error path. In Ruby, we are mostly optimistic, which is okay. Yet we really need proper flow control. So this is what we are going to see here. So this is very optimistic code. So we don't see the rest of the URL. We don't care that much, but it depends on the user ID. So it's a service. Here I use new plus arguments, and there is only one public method, which is call. The way to use it is service.new, pass the arguments and call, and then it returns the appropriate data. So it's very easy, but yeah, basically it's hope for the best because you are not sure what happens, and yeah, you just don't know. There is the exception implementation, which is definitely longer. So it's the same structure overall. You have the call, and depending on the response object you get from HTTP party, you either return the body or you raise an exception. So exceptions are mostly disputed in Rails. So many people have very different opinion about them. Some consensus say you shouldn't use them because they're supposedly slow. Some say you shouldn't use them because if you have very specific exceptions and you basically rescue in another part of your application, it's like leaking names outside of the service itself. So it's really debatable. It's like, yeah, basically it's a religion war. There is no truth. It's like do as you prefer. But well, it's one of the many implementation you can get, and the way to implement here is the following. So you call your exception service, and if everything went well, you have the happy path with the puts. Otherwise, you have the rescue, which is here to save you. So here we have the Boolean example. And so what does it bring? It brings a success instance variable inside. So and there is a method associated to it. So the way to use it is pretty straightforward. You instantiate your service, you call it, and then on success you do something else. You do something, and if no success, you do something else. So it's okay-ish. You'll see different. We have two remaining implementations. The first, oh no, three actually. So the event service is based basically on events, and Whisper is a very it's like the most used library for the events. So here we have a different. We have again our two different paths: the happy path where we broadcast success, and the error path where we broadcast the error and the reason of the error. In order to use it, you instantiate the service, and then you say on success do this, on error do that, and finally you call it. And depending on what is broadcasted, either block would be executed. We have the monads way of handling the success and failure. So actually in monads, it's generally used, implemented with right and left values, but in the Ruby implementation, it's based on success. So again, here you have success and failure, and depending on what happens, the different binds are executed. So each one is executed if everything went fine, and if something failed at some point, the OR block is executed. Yeah, syntax-wise, I don't like the fact you have absolutely to return true or false to the bind blocks. Otherwise, if you return something falsy, like puts does, it will be considered as a problem in the success chain, and then would be considered as a failure, and the OR would be executed as well, which we don't want. And so this is yeah, basically this is my jam, so of course I prefer it, but again, well, it's based on the same So each time it's the same, the same principle. You have a success and you have the error pass. What happens here is it looks like functional programming, but basically you have blocks of code which are executed. The chain blocks are executed if everything went fine, and the on-dam are executed if something went wrong. So you can see we have a dam here, and if the dam is happened, we go to this block. Otherwise, we only execute this chain one. So if you just compare those different implementations, they are not that different. And what I want to show you now is what happens whenever you want to change them, which is actually the point. Because chaining properly is very useful. It's actually what you do in your everyday life as a programmer. Because whenever you have small and reusable objects, you just want them you just want to use them. But like here we have a convert file, then we extract picture, then we extract translation segments. So it's from my company code. And each step could fail or succeed, and you want to know why. And this is the point of chaining. Chaining is supposed to be efficient and tell you if something bad happens. And if something bad happens, maybe you want the other things to be executed, maybe not. So that's the whole point. And we'll see the very same implementations we had before in the context of chaining. So for the exception, it's actually very easy. It's the same setup with only one rescue. So we get the useful data from one service or another, and then we put. And if ever something wrong happens, we have one rescue block responsible for the whole. And actually, when you have like a Boolean service object, things become complicated because you see your whole code is going east. And it can be very tricky if you have many, I mean, like here we only have two, but it could be very annoying to have these different if-else everywhere. At least it's something I don't like, but actually it's basically it's basically the if-else success pattern, and we can definitely see the same for the event-based, because it's basically the same problem. Each time you add another service in the chain, and because you want the whole chain to be executed, you add the logic and you want to ensure it succeeded or not. And based on this, you have to react on different happy or unhappy passes. So the example for monads is actually terrible, but my point here was to be able to get in the last bind the whole values, all the values from value 1 from monadic service new 1 and 4.4. And so there is, it's a bit cumbersome. It could be very simplified with some instance variable, but well, for the sake of the chaining, I wanted to show you that if you want to get some value and pass it and have a final result created, it makes things complicated, but yeah, it can be simplified. And the waterfall implementation is this one. So this is what I wanted. So basically, you just chain. If something goes wrong, it goes to the undam. And if everything is okay, the chain blocks are executed one after another. Well, we have plenty of time to discuss the examples. I just wanted to show you the point and the different flavors, different kind of implementations. What is important, though, is that generally speaking, any solution you choose, as long as you use service object in general it's fine because it's very the first step to a nicer architecture, and whatever the architecture you choose or the framework you choose, it serves as a facade and basically remain untouched. So once you progressively move your code into service objects, you have your business logic isolated. You can, of course, properly test it, and it's basically facade, and it makes sense everywhere. It doesn't depend on the software, on the architecture you get. And actually, we're done. That closes my talk. Thank you very much. Whenever you choose the event path, it's the very common one are success failure. This is why it's sometimes it's if you use events only for success and error, you are basically recreating the Node.js callback hell, where you have all the callbacks chaining one after another. In order to answer your question, if it's very specific, maybe you could just have a class inheriting from your initial class, which broadcasts this very specific event in any situation you need. Or if it's in controller, like you said, maybe you could just wrap inside one of your success path. But it's complicated to give an answer from that. I would need a very concrete example to be able to answer. Is everybody convinced about the use? I wouldn't say necessity, but the added value of service objects. Mostly, yes. Most people are nodded, so take it for a yes. Yep. Yeah, of course, of course. So there is no rule here. So we saw in Simone's talk. We saw a very good example where in a class did rely on an external service. And he was testing it and it was complicated, so he said, yeah, maybe I should pass this service, which actually doesn't really belong to my current service object, as a dependency. So it's what is called dependency injection. So it's a way to do it, but if both of them are really tied, you could just have them as the default value. But yeah, it's good enough, let's say. Does it answer? Yeah, I haven't. I mostly use the built-in tools we have for workers in this kind of situation, because well, they are designed for this purpose, and generally speaking, in the context where I'm just responding to an HTTP request, I don't want to have to respond for too long. I want the answer to be the response to arrive quickly. So I prefer to fail and fail fast in that case. And if ever it's more in a worker, then I let the worker engine handle this. So actually, yeah, there are a lot of alternatives, and I don't use Trailblazer, but I like Trailblazer because it exposes some design patterns which are very important, and I hope you know. Basically, if you don't need a service object, maybe for a sign-up form, you request like just email and password. Well, in the sign-up form, you likely require first name, last name, email, password, and in this case, you want to validate that everything is present. But if you put it in your model, the day your boss arrives with a list of with a CSV with only emails, you're basically in good and bad position because you'd have to get invalid objects. So one of the very useful design pattern is the form object, where you validate very specific information, and it's really tied to a specific form. Yeah, I'd say it's complementary. It's the usual drill, and it's not an alternative. It's the usual drill. You end up with the fat controllers. Then when all developers were slapped, they say, yeah, move everything back to the model. And then it's like 5 years or so ago, there was like a page saying, yeah, if you want to avoid both, options are, and actually there are many, but the different design patterns answer different needs. So you have like query objects to have very specific queries in order not to pollute your controller. You have the form object. You have the service object, which is an action actually. What can I? Yeah, the event publisher is very useful. Basically, I use it to create logs only. The tooling is well, design patterns are not Ruby specific, and they are basically general for programming good use or good patterns actually, and every single one has a specific added value. Like for service object is the command. It's supposedly the command pattern, so I don't see any replacement. But it could be you could simplify your code, the different responsibilities of your code using other patterns if you don't want this one in particular. Yeah, because basically DHH says it's real bullshit to create an object each time you have your controller an action in the control triggered, and actually I do because each time I want to do something, and the do something is usually it ends up being a service object. Yeah, of course, it's part of the way people instantiate it. And actually, most of the time when people instantiate the service object with a class method, behind the scenes they do a new with the params they received in order to, in their code, to be able to access the different variables without having to pass them to every single method. So indeed, you could just have it as a class method, but generally speaking, if inside your service object, because unless it's very short or you don't care about having a big chunk of code, which could be okay, and you don't necessarily want to pass the different arguments. You don't want to pass arguments because you can store them as an instance variable. But yeah, it's mostly a question of implementation. And as I told you, most of the time when it's done at the class level, it's end up in the implementation, and actually you don't care as being an instance created. So to orchestrate, among the gem the gem list I presented, there is an interactor made by Thoughtbot, and actually they have this concept, like they create different interactors, and then you can create a class and say, yeah, I want to organize this service, comma this service, comma this service, and actually it means they will be executed in a row and share like a global context. So this is a way to have them orchestrated. It's something I feel, it's something I don't really like. First thing, to share a context between across all objects, it feels wrong to me, and that's why I have my my own magic sauce. But orchestrate in the end is just, I call this one, was it okay, was it not, and then happy and unhappy pass.